I gave my son everything. 35 years of sweat, blood, and tears on this land. And 3 days later, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "You should start packing." Not a question, not an apology, just a cold command from the son I had raised my whole life. If you want to know what a mother does when betrayed by her own child, like this post, comment the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has come. And don't leave, because what happens next will shock you. The morning I signed over Silver Creek Ranch, I told myself I was doing the right thing. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We convince ourselves that the right thing and the painful thing are the same. We dress sacrifice up in the language of love and hand it over with both hands, smiling, so our children don't have to see how much it costs us. I had been alone on this land for 11 years by then. 11 years since Thomas Hart was buried under the old elm at the edge of the east pasture, the one he'd planted himself as a sapling the year we got married. 11 years of waking up at 4:30 in the morning to feed animals that didn't care what day it was. 11 years of fixing what broke, paying what was owed, and holding this place together by sheer stubbornness because letting it fall apart would have felt like losing Thomas all over again. Silver Creek Ranch wasn't just property. It was the first 30 years of my life, folded into 400 acres of grass, fence line, and red Oklahoma dirt. But I was 63 years old. My right knee had been giving me trouble since the previous winter. Luke Mercer, my ranch hand, was reliable, but he wasn't getting any younger either, and I couldn't ask a man in his late 50s to carry the weight of a full operation indefinitely. The practical voice in my head, the one that sounds like my mother, the one I've been trying to ignore my whole life, kept whispering the same thing. "You can't do this forever, Evelyn." And Logan had seemed so ready. That's the part I keep coming back to, even now. He had seemed so ready. He'd flown in from Houston on a Thursday evening, arriving in that silver truck he'd rented from the airport, wearing pressed dark jeans and a button-down that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. He'd hugged me at the door and said, "Mom, you look tired," which was the closest Logan ever came to saying he was worried about me. We'd sat at the kitchen table that night with coffee and the pecan pie I'd baked because I knew it was his favorite, and he'd talked about his work, something in commercial real estate development. Though whenever he explained the details, my eyes glazed over after the third sentence. Logan had always moved in a world I didn't fully understand. Finance, projections, liquidity, words that sounded like a foreign language spoken in an air-conditioned room very far from where I'd spent my life. But he'd looked at me with those serious gray eyes of his, like Thomas's eyes. That's always what killed me, that he had his father's eyes. And he'd said, "Mom, I've been thinking. I want to come back. Not full-time right away, but I want to be more involved with the ranch. I think it's time we talked about the future." And I had felt something loosen in my chest, because that was all I had ever wanted to hear. The transfer paperwork took 2 weeks to prepare. Walter Pierce, who had handled our family's legal matters for going on 25 years, was thorough and unhurried about the whole thing. He sat across from me in his small office in town and made sure I understood every line of what I was signing. He was the kind of attorney who talked slowly, not because he thought you were stupid, but because he believed important things deserved to be said without rushing. "You're transferring full title of Silver Creek Ranch to Logan James Hart," he said, reading through the document one final time. 412 acres, mineral rights, and all structures on the property. Evelyn, once this is recorded, the land will belong to him. "I know what I'm doing, Walter." He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "I know you do. I just want to make sure you know what he's getting." I signed on the dotted line. I told myself that was love. The biggest, most selfless version of it. I told myself Thomas would have done the same. Sam, the first thing Logan did the next morning was take photographs. Not sentimental ones. Not the kind you take because a place means something to you. He walked the property with his phone out, moving fast, snapping pictures of the barn roof, the water tank, the old equipment shed, the road down to the creek. He had his phone pressed to his ear half the time, speaking in that clipped, business-like voice he used when he didn't want to be interrupted, and I caught fragments of conversation as he passed near the porch. Yes, the total acreage is over 400. No, the existing structures have value for the initial phase, but long-term we're looking at... Hold on, I need to check the east fence line. I stood at the kitchen window washing the breakfast dishes and told myself I was overreacting. He was being practical. He was a businessman. Of course he was assessing the property. That didn't mean anything, but there was something in the way he walked across the land. Fast, purposeful, impatient, like someone who had somewhere else to be and was just checking a box. Thomas had never walked Silver Creek that way. Thomas walked slow. He'd stop to crouch down and look at the grass, to check on a fence post that had been leaning since last spring, to watch a hawk circling over the south pasture like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. This land had been worth stopping for. I tried to push the comparison out of my head. Luke found me in the barn that afternoon, working through the back stall. "Your boy's been out measuring things," he said carefully. Luke had a gift for making neutral statements that weren't neutral at all. "He's planning ahead," I said. "That's how he is." Luke was quiet for a moment, which with him usually meant more than if he'd spoken. He asked me about water rights this morning, specifically about whether they transferred with the deed. I turned to look at him. "Why would he ask you about that?" Luke shrugged one shoulder. "Figured you'd want to know," he asked. I went back to work and tried to let the familiar weight of the pitchfork in my hand settle my nerves. It didn't. Dinner that second night was harder. Logan sat at the head of the table, Thomas's chair, which no one had sat in for 11 years. And I watched him do it with the casual ease of a man who had already rewritten the ownership in his own mind. He talked about plans over the pot roast, refinancing, leverage, bringing in investors who specialized in rural property development. He used phrases like maximizing the asset and repurposing underutilized acreage, and every single phrase landed like a small stone dropped into still water. "You're talking about developing it," I said, when I could no longer let the conversation carry past me. He looked up. "I'm talking about making it profitable, Mom. This place has been running at about a third of what it could generate." "It's a cattle ranch. It generates cattle." He set down his fork with a patience that somehow felt like condescension. "It's 400 acres of prime Oklahoma real estate 30 minutes outside of town. Do you understand what that's worth right now? I have people who would—" "I know what it's worth," I said. "I've been paying the taxes on it for 35 years. He looked at me the way he had started looking at me since he arrived, like he was waiting for me to catch up, like I was a small, slightly frustrating obstacle in an otherwise efficient plan. "Mom," he said, "you gave me the ranch. I'm going to run it the way I know how to run things. That's what you wanted, right? For me to take care of it?" I didn't answer. Because I realized, sitting there at my own kitchen table with the smell of the pot roast I'd made from scratch still hanging in the air, that what he'd just said was technically true and had nothing to do with what I'd actually wanted. He'd taken a gift and turned it into permission. It was the following morning when everything collapsed. I was on the back porch early, as I always was, watching the light come up over the east fields. That hour just before sunrise was always mine. Thomas and I used to drink coffee out there in silence that didn't need to be filled, watching the sky change. Even after he was gone, I kept the habit. Some mornings, it was the only part of the day that still felt like mine. Logan came out at 7:30, which for him was sleeping in. He had his laptop open and a call already on speaker, and he sat up at the porch table without looking at me first, typing as he talked. "The transfer's done. It just needs to be recorded. Should clear by end of week. Once that happens, we can move to the next phase." I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug and waited. He ended the call after a few minutes and finally looked over. Something in my face must have given me away because he shifted in his chair and said, "That was my development contact. We've been talking about a partnership. It's a good deal, Mom. It's going to—" "Partnership with who?" "A firm out of Dallas. They specialize in rural land conversion, high-end residential communities, some mixed use. You're going to build houses on Silver Creek." He exhaled. "I'm going to make the land work for its potential instead of—" "Logan," my voice came out quieter than I expected. "What happens to the cattle operation?" He was quiet long enough that I already knew. "We'd phase it out. The revenue from the development deal is going to be, this is a cattle ranch. This land has been a cattle ranch since before your father was born. We don't phase that out." "Mom," and here it was. The tone I hadn't heard since he was a teenager trying to explain why a rule didn't apply to him. Measured, practiced. You transferred the title to me. This is my ranch now. I get to make the decisions about what happens here. The words sat between us on the porch like something that couldn't be unsaid. And where do I fit in your plans? I asked. He didn't answer immediately, which was already the answer. You've been talking about wanting to slow down, he finally said, about how the upkeep is too much. I thought maybe you'd want to. There are some really nice retirement communities in the area, facilities with a lot of amenities where you could. I'm asking you if you are telling me to leave my home. I'm saying the property is mine now, and I have plans for it that require. Logan, my voice had gone very flat and very still. Are you telling me to leave? He closed his laptop. You should start thinking about where you want to go, he said. I'm going to need the main house for the operations center. I can give you a few weeks, maybe a month. But Mom, this was always going to be a transition. You knew that. I had not known that. I looked at my son, this man I had nursed through ear infections and walked to school and driven to baseball practice and waited up for and loved with the specific, irrational completeness that is the disease of motherhood. And I understood something I had been refusing to understand for 2 days. He had not come back for the ranch. He had come back for what the ranch was worth. And I had handed it to him, us. I don't remember walking inside. I remember sitting down in the chair by the front window and looking at my own living room, the quilt on the armchair that my mother had made, the photographs on the mantel, the wooden side table Thomas had built the winter before Logan was born, and feeling something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage, but was both of them underneath, pressing up like water through cracked ground. Luke knocked on the door frame at lunchtime and took one look at me. What did he do? He asked. He told me to start packing, I said. Luke stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking. I'd known him for 14 years, long enough to know what silence meant on his face. You want me to talk to him? No? Evelyn, I need to think, I said. He nodded and left me alone. And that was what I did. I sat in that chair for a very long time, and I thought, not about how much it hurt, though it hurt in ways I didn't have words for, the specific kind of hurt that only comes from having loved something completely and watched it be indifferent to you. I thought about what Walter had said in his office, reading from the document slowly and carefully the way he always did. Once this is recorded, the land will belong to him. Once. This is recorded. I reached for the phone on the side table and looked at the clock. Walter's office opened at 8:30. It was 8:52. I dialed his number with a hand that had stopped shaking somewhere in the middle of all that thinking, and when his assistant answered, I said, This is Evelyn Hart. I need Walter to call me back the moment he's free. It's about the Silver Creek transfer. Tell him it's urgent. I hung up and looked out the window at my land, the land that was still, for a few more hours, technically in the process of becoming someone else's. And I made myself a promise. I wasn't packing a single thing. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are fictional. Walter called me back at 9:17. I had not moved from the chair by the window. I'd let my coffee go cold and hadn't bothered to reheat it. Outside, I could see Logan crossing the yard toward the barn with his phone out again, walking that same fast, purposeful walk that made my chest tighten every time I watched it. He moved across my land like a man who was already somewhere else in his head. Evelyn. Walter's voice was careful in that way it got when he already sensed something was wrong before you told him. Sandra said it was urgent. Has the deed been recorded yet? A pause, the sound of papers. No, the county recorder's office received the filing, but it won't process until, let me check, Thursday at the earliest, sometimes Friday, depending on their backlog. Why? I exhaled slowly. I need to revoke it. Another pause, longer this time. Evelyn, what's happened? Walter, I need to know if I can revoke it. Before it records, is that possible? He was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Technically, yes. A deed transfer can be revoked before official recordation if the grantor files a formal revocation and the transfer hasn't been legally completed. But Evelyn, this is serious. Once you do this, you can't. I know what I'm doing, I said. The same words I'd said to him 2 weeks ago, sitting across from his desk. This time, they felt earned in a way they hadn't before. Tell me what happened, he said. So I told him. I kept it short and factual because I didn't trust myself to get through it any other way. I told him about the photographs and the phone calls, about the development firm in Dallas, about the word repurpose being applied to land my husband had put his whole life into, and I told him what Logan had said on the porch that morning, word for word, because I hadn't forgotten a single one. You should start thinking about where you want to go. When I finished, Walter was quiet again for a moment. Come in this afternoon, he said. 2 o'clock. I'll have the revocation paperwork ready. I spent the hours between that phone call and my appointment doing what I always did when I needed to get through something hard. I worked. There were stalls that needed mucking, water troughs that needed checking, a section of fence along the north pasture that Luke had flagged earlier in the week. Physical work had always been the thing that kept my thoughts from eating me alive. Thomas used to say I processed grief through a shovel, which was true and not entirely a compliment. Luke found me at the fence line around 11, and he fell into step beside me the way he always did when he had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. Logan asked me this morning whether the ranch hands had employment contracts, he said finally. I stopped walking. What did you tell him? Told him I worked on a handshake with you and Thomas for 14 years and never had a problem with it. He paused. He wrote something down. The image of that, Logan writing something down after talking to Luke, filing away the information for whatever came next, made my stomach drop in a way I hadn't expected. This wasn't impulsive anger on his part. This was methodical. He'd been planning this, or something like it, before he ever got on that plane from Houston. I'm going to see Walter this afternoon, I said. Luke looked at me sideways. The lawyer? There may still be time to stop the recording. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the pasture. Then he said, You want me to drive you? I can drive myself. I know you can, he said, in a tone that meant that wasn't the point. I let him drive me. Logan was on the porch again when we pulled out of the driveway, phone to his ear, not watching us go. I looked at him through the passenger window and tried to find the boy I recognized somewhere in the man standing there, and the worst part was I could still see him. That was always the worst part. If he had been a stranger, it would have been simpler. But he had Thomas's eyes and my stubborn jaw, and he had cried on my shoulder in this very driveway the day his father's funeral was over, and loving someone that completely didn't just switch off because they betrayed you. It went underground instead. It turned into something that hurt differently. Walter's office was in a 2-story brick building on Clement Street that had been there longer than either of us. His assistant Sandra showed me back immediately, and Walter was already at his desk with a folder open in front of him. He was a tall, lean man in his early 70s with reading glasses. He was perpetually losing, in a manner that made you feel like the most important thing in any room was whatever you'd come to discuss. He stood when I came in and waited until I sat before he sat back down. Old manners. I had always appreciated that about him. I looked at the timeline again, he said, opening the folder. The deed was filed Monday. Today is Wednesday. If we file the revocation today, before close of business, we beat the recording window. Then let's file it today. He looked at me steadily. Evelyn, I want to make sure you understand what this means. You'll be taking the ranch back, fully and permanently. Logan will have no legal claim to the property. I understand. He may contest it. He may argue. Let him argue. Walter held my gaze for another moment. Then he nodded once, the way a man nods when he's decided to trust your judgment, and slid the papers across the desk. I read every line this time, slowly, without anyone hurrying me, and then I signed. The drive home felt different from the drive there. I can't explain it precisely. Nothing had changed yet. Logan was still on that porch. The ranch was still in this suspended state between what it had been and what he was planning to turn it into. But something had shifted in me. Some door had closed that I hadn't even realized was open, swinging in the wind, letting in cold air. Luke didn't say much on the way back. He asked once if I was hungry, and I said no, and he left it at that. That was something I valued in him. He never filled silence with words just to fill it. When we pulled back into the driveway, Logan was no longer on the porch. His rental truck was still there. I went inside and found him at the kitchen table with his laptop open and what looked like architectural renderings spread across one side of the table. Printed pages, the kind you'd get from a professional firm, full color, with aerial layouts and small labeled structures. He glanced up when I came in. "Where'd you go?" "Into town," I said, and moved toward the kitchen to finally make myself something to eat. "I've been trying to reach the county recorder's office," he said, turning back to his screen. "They said the deed would process by Thursday. I need the official recorded copy to move forward with the partnership agreement. Did Walter mention a timeline when you talked to him?" I opened the refrigerator and stood looking into it. I didn't ask about the timeline. "Can you call him? It would help to know if it's Thursday morning or—" "Logan." I took out the leftover pot roast from the night before and set it on the counter. "There's something you should know." He looked up again, and something in my voice must have reached him, because this time he actually looked at me instead of through me. "What?" "I filed a revocation this afternoon. The deed transfer has been canceled." The silence that followed had a specific quality I hadn't heard before. Not the comfortable silences of this house, not the loaded ones of the past 2 days. This was the silence of something breaking. "What did you just say?" "The deed hadn't been officially recorded yet. Under Oklahoma property law, a grantor can revoke a transfer before recordation. I filed the paperwork with Walter this afternoon. Silver Creek Ranch is still mine." Logan stood up from the table slowly, and the architectural rendering slid toward the edge as he did. "You can't do that," he said. "I already did." "Mom." His voice had gone very controlled in a way that was more frightening than if he'd raised it. "I have a business partnership agreement. I have investors who are expecting. I have already started moving on this deal. You can't just—" "I just did," I said again. You didn't even talk to me. You just went behind my back and—" "You told me to pack my things," I said. "That was this morning. You stood on my porch and told me to start thinking about where I was going to go. Did you talk to me before you did that?" He opened his mouth and closed it. "I gave you this land because I thought you wanted to come home," I said, and my voice was steadier than I had any right to expect. "I gave it to you because I thought you loved it the way your father loved it, the way I love it. I was wrong about that. And the transfer wasn't recorded yet, so I revoked it. That's what happened. You're going to destroy everything I've been working toward." His voice cracked slightly on the word destroy, and for just a moment I saw something real move across his face. Not guilt, not remorse, but the specific panic of a person watching a plan they'd built in secret start to come apart. "Do you have any idea how much is riding on this? The investors, the timeline, Mom, I have already made commitments based on this deal." "You made commitments on property that wasn't yours yet," I said. "That's not my fault, Logan. You signed it over to me. And I revoked it. Today. Legally." I turned back to the counter and started pulling together something for dinner because my hands needed something to do. "The paperwork is filed. Walter will send you official notification tomorrow." He left the kitchen without another word. I heard his footsteps down the hall, heard the guest room door shut with more force than was necessary, but less than a slam. Logan had always expressed anger at exactly one notch below whatever would make him look out of control. Even now, even with everything falling apart around him, he was managing his image. I stood at the stove and let the heat from the burner warm my hands and tried to figure out what I was feeling. It wasn't satisfaction. I want to be honest about that because some people might expect that part. The part where you fight back and it feels like winning. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like surviving, which is a different thing entirely, and a lonelier one. What I felt was grief with a hard edge to it. Grief for the son I thought I had, and the relationship I had believed we were building when he called me last month and said he wanted to come home. Grief for the version of this moment I had imagined. Logan learning the land, walking the fence lines the way Thomas had walked them, putting down roots in this red dirt the way our family had done for 3 generations. That wasn't what this was. That had never been what this was. I just hadn't wanted to see it. Luke knocked on the back door after supper, and I let him in for coffee. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, and I told him what had happened, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he wrapped both hands around his mug and was quiet for a long moment. "What's he going to do?" Luke asked. "I don't know," I said. "He made commitments to investors. I imagine that's going to cause problems for him." "Is he going to fight it legally?" "Walter says the revocation is solid. The deed wasn't recorded. He may try something, but Walter doesn't think he has a case." Luke nodded slowly. "And how are you?" Nobody else had asked me that all day. I had to think about it for a moment. "I'm all right," I said. And then, more honestly, I'm tired. I'm tired in a way that sleep probably won't fix. "Yeah," Luke said. "That kind makes sense." We sat in silence for a while, and outside the kitchen window the last of the daylight was finishing off, pulling down the darkness over the fields. The cattle would be settled for the night. The east fence was still leaning and would need to be addressed before the weekend. The ranch was still there. Still mine. Still the same 412 acres it had always been. The same red dirt, the same creek that gave it its name, the same elm at the edge of the east pasture under which Thomas was buried. I was still here, and for tonight, that had to be enough. Logan did not come out of the guest room that night. I heard him on the phone at some point, the low, urgent murmur of a conversation happening behind a closed door, and I didn't try to make out what he was saying. I made myself go to bed at 10 o'clock, which was later than usual, and lay in the dark looking at the ceiling of the room I had shared with Thomas for 24 years. I thought about what Logan had said. "Do you have any idea how much is riding on this?" I thought about the investors in Dallas, the partnership agreement, the architectural renderings spread across my kitchen table like this was already decided, already done, already someone else's future being built on top of mine. I thought about the fact that he'd had those drawings printed before the deed was recorded, before it was legally final. He'd already been moving forward. He'd already been building the next chapter of his plan, while I was still believing he'd come home out of love. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did come, it came shallow. I woke at 4:30 as I always did, and the house was quiet, and outside the window the sky over Silver Creek was the deep particular blue of the hour before dawn, which I had looked at more mornings than I could count, and which still, even now, looked like something worth protecting. I got up. I put on the coffee. I pulled on my boots. There was work to do. And then, from down the hall, I heard Logan's alarm go off. And then footsteps, and then the sound of a bag being zipped. And I understood, without having to be told, that he had already decided what came next. The only question was what he'd brought with him. Outside. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are fictional. He came out of that guest room at 7 in the morning with his bag already packed. I was at the stove when I heard his footsteps in the hallway. Heavier than usual, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who had been awake most of the night rehearsing what he was going to say. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the pan and listened to him set his bag down near the door and pull out a chair at the kitchen table, and the specific sound of that. The scrape of the chair on the floor of my kitchen, the kitchen I had cooked 35 years of meals in, made something in me go very quiet and very still. "I called an attorney last night," he said. I turned the burner down and turned around. Logan was sitting at the table with his hands flat on the surface, the way he used to sit as a teenager when he was preparing to argue about something and wanted to look like the reasonable one in the room. His face was composed, tired under the eyes, but composed. "His name is Naomi Cross," he continued. "She specializes in property and estate law. I explained the situation, and she believes there may be grounds to challenge the revocation." I looked at him for a moment. "All right," I said. That wasn't the response he'd expected. He'd expected something, alarm maybe, or defensiveness, or the kind of immediate capitulation that had probably worked on me before in smaller arguments over smaller things. What he got was me turning back to the stove and sliding 2 eggs onto a plate. "Mom, I'm serious." She said that if I can demonstrate that the original transfer represented a binding agreement, that there was consideration on both sides, that I relied on the transfer in good faith and made significant financial commitments based on it. There may be a case for promissory estoppel. Have you eaten? I asked. What? Breakfast. Have you eaten? I'm not... Mom, I'm trying to tell you that this isn't over. I set my plate on the table and sat down across from him. I heard you. You hired an attorney. She thinks she has an argument. She does have an argument. Then let her make it. I picked up my fork. Walter has handled property law in this county for 30 years. If Naomi Cross wants to file something, Walter will answer it. That's what attorneys do. Logan stared at me. You're not even going to discuss this. What would you like to discuss, Logan? Whether you had the right to plan a land development deal on property that hadn't been legally transferred to you yet? Whether you should have told me the truth about what you were planning before I signed anything? I kept my voice level, because those are the conversations I'd like to have. If you want to talk about something else, I'm not sure I have a lot to add. He pushed back from the table and stood up. You don't understand what you've done to me. I revoked a deed before it was recorded. That's what I've done. I have investors. I have a signed letter of intent with a development firm. I have people who put money into this based on my word that the land was secured. His voice was rising now, the careful composure starting to fracture at the edges. Do you know what it looks like when a deal falls apart because the property owner changes her mind? Do you know what that does to my reputation in this business? I know what it did to mine, I said quietly, when my son told me to start packing. The kitchen went silent. Logan stood by the table with his jaw set and his hands at his sides, and for a moment he looked so much like Thomas in an argument. That same stubborn set to his shoulders, that same inability to fully conceal the emotion underneath the controlled surface, that it hurt in a way I hadn't prepared for. Thomas and I had fought over the years. Real fights, the kind that came from two people who were both too sure of themselves living in close quarters. But Thomas had never once made me feel like a tenant in my own home. I'm not leaving, I said. Not today, not next week, not because an attorney files a motion I'll have to respond to. This is my land, and I'm not leaving it. If you want to take this to court, we'll go to court. But I want you to think very carefully about what that looks like for both of us. Logan picked up his bag. Naomi will be in touch with Walter, he said. Don't make this harder than it has to be. He walked out the back door, and I listened to his truck start in the driveway, and I sat at the kitchen table with my breakfast going cold in front of me and thought about the fact that my son had just threatened to sue me for the land I'd spent my life building. And somewhere underneath the shock of that was a grief so layered and so old it felt less like a new wound and more like an injury I'd been walking on for years without knowing it. Walter called me that afternoon. Logan's attorney contacted our office this morning, he said without preamble. Naomi Cross. I know her work. She's competent. She's not going to file something frivolous. But Evelyn, I want to be honest with you about where we stand. Tell me. She's going to argue promissory estoppel. The theory is that Logan reasonably relied on your promise, the signed deed, and made significant financial commitments based on that reliance. If she can show the court that he suffered real financial harm because you revoked the transfer, a judge might look at it. My hand tightened on the phone. Might. It's a difficult argument to win, especially since the deed was never recorded. Legally, an unrecorded deed transfer is not complete. That's well established. But courts have some discretion in estoppel cases, and if she brings in evidence of the investment commitments, the signed letters of intent, proof of money already spent, he paused. It's not a slam dunk for either side, is what I'm telling you. What do you need from me? Documentation of everything, the original transfer, the revocation filing, any communications you had with Logan about his intentions for the property, anything in writing. He left those architectural drawings on my kitchen table, I said. From the development firm. Walter was quiet for a moment. Don't touch them. I'll send someone to photograph them in place. That's actually helpful to us. It demonstrates he was already acting on the property before the transfer was legally complete, which undermines the good faith reliance argument. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long moment looking at the rolled pages still spread across the corner of the table where Logan had left them. Aerial photographs of Silver Creek from above, little labeled boxes where structures would go, a road cutting through the south pasture where there had never been a road. I left them exactly where they were. 3 days passed without a word from Logan directly. Walter communicated with Naomi Cross's office and kept me updated in brief, factual calls that I appreciated more than I could say. Luke kept the ranch running, as he always did, steady and without drama, which was its own kind of comfort. I slept badly every night and worked hard every day and tried not to let my mind run too far ahead of whatever the next development would be. On the fourth morning, Walter called at 8 o'clock. "Naomi Cross wants to meet," he said. "In person. She's requesting a sit-down with you present. She says she wants to discuss the situation directly before any formal filing." "What does that mean?" "It means she's not sure her case is as strong as she told Logan it was. Attorneys who are confident don't usually ask for informal meetings before filing. They file." He let that settle for a moment. "I think she may have done more research into the property transfer timeline and found the same thing I found, that the unrecorded status creates a significant problem for their argument. She wants to see if there's a resolution before she commits her client to an expensive case she might not win." "And what does Logan want?" "According to her, Logan wants the ranch back, or he wants compensation for his losses." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because after everything, after the photographs, the development plans, the order to pack my bags, the attorney threat over breakfast, he still thought there was a version of this where he walked away with something I owed him. "Set up the meeting," I said. It happened 2 days later in Walter's office on Clement Street. I arrived first, which I'd done on purpose. I wanted to be seated and settled before anyone else came in, because I knew that walking into a room already full of people waiting for you puts you at a psychological disadvantage, and I was done putting myself at disadvantages where my son was concerned. Logan came in 5 minutes later with Naomi Cross, who was a precise, sharp-featured woman in her 40s with close-cropped hair and the careful posture of someone who had learned to make herself look unreadable. She shook my hand firmly and Walter's hand and sat next to Logan across the table from us. Logan didn't quite meet my eyes when he sat down. Naomi opened a folder and got straight to it, which I respected. "Mrs. Hart, thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I'd like to speak plainly, if that's all right with everyone." "Please," I said. "I've reviewed the timeline of the deed transfer and the revocation in detail. My initial read was that a promissory estoppel argument had merit, given the financial commitments my client made in reliance on the transfer." She paused. "After further research, I need to be honest with my client and with you. The legal standard in Oklahoma for unrecorded deed revocation is fairly clear. The grantor retains the right to revoke before official recordation, and courts have consistently upheld that right in cases similar to this one." Across the table, I heard Logan exhale sharply. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying that if we file, the most likely outcome is that the court upholds the revocation." She kept her voice even and professional, which I imagined was difficult given that she was telling her client he'd hired her for nothing. "I can make the estoppel argument, but I want to be transparent. The financial commitments you made were made on an unrecorded transfer. A reasonable person in a property transaction knows that a deed is not legally complete until it's recorded. That knowledge weakens the good faith reliance element significantly." "So you're telling me she can just take it back," Logan said. "She signs it over, I build my entire plan around it, and she just takes it back. And there's nothing I can do." "I'm telling you that litigation is expensive, the odds are against you, and a settlement may be more practical than a court battle." She folded her hands on the table. "Mrs. Hart, is there any arrangement that would be acceptable to you? A buyout option, a partial interest?" "No," I said. She nodded as if she'd expected that. "Then I have to advise my client that proceeding to litigation carries significant financial risk for a low probability of success." Logan turned to look at me fully for the first time since he'd walked in, and what I saw on his face was not what I expected. I had braced myself for more anger, for the controlled fury of that breakfast conversation, or worse. What I saw instead was something rawer and harder to look at. The specific expression of a person who has realized too late that they miscalculated something important and cannot figure out how to get back to before the mistake. "Mom," he said. His voice had changed. The businessman was gone. This was something underneath that, younger and less armored. Can we talk?" Not through attorneys, just us. Walter looked at me. I gave him a small nod, and he and Naomi both stood, murmuring something about giving us a few minutes, and stepped out into the hallway. Logan and I sat across from each other in the empty office, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I didn't plan it the way it looked, he said finally. What did you plan then? He rubbed one hand across his face, a gesture I recognized from Thomas, the gesture of a man running out of ways to explain himself. I thought, I had this deal in front of me, a real one, a big one. And when you started talking about transferring the ranch, I thought maybe there was a way to do both, to honor the land and make the deal work. You told an investor the land was secured before the deed was recorded. I know. You printed architectural plans for a residential development and spread them across my kitchen table. I know. You told me to start packing. He flinched, actually flinched, which was the first genuine thing I had seen from him since he arrived. I shouldn't have said that. I had a call that morning that went badly, and I was trying to manage about 6 different things, and I said it wrong. I didn't mean, Logan. I stopped him. You meant it. You'd already decided. The drawings were already printed. He didn't argue with that, which told me everything about whether he actually had an answer. I love this ranch, he said, after a long moment. I know you don't believe that right now, but I do. I believe you love what it's worth, I said. I'm not sure that's the same thing. He looked at the table. Something moved across his face that might have been shame, or might have been just the exhaustion of a person who'd been running a version of events in his head for days that the facts kept refusing to support. What happens now? He asked. Now Naomi tells you that you don't have a case. You go back to Houston and deal with your investors however you have to deal with them. And I go home and feed my cattle. And us? I looked at my son, at Thomas's eyes in a face I had known since before it was a face, since it was a blurry shape on an ultrasound that the technician had pointed to and said, "There's your baby, Mrs. Hart." And I told him the truth because he was my son, and he deserved the truth even if he hadn't given me the same courtesy. I don't know, I said. I genuinely don't know. What you did wasn't a mistake in the heat of the moment. It was a plan. Plans take time to make. You had time to think about what you were doing, and you did it anyway, and some part of me is going to have to figure out what to do with that. I can't tell you right now what that looks like. I'm not sure you'd like the honest answer, even if I had one. He nodded slowly. His jaw was working the way it did when he was holding something back. Walter knocked once on the door frame and leaned in. Whenever you're ready. I stood up. Logan stood up across from me. For a moment, we were just 2 people standing in a small office with the late morning light coming through the window, and the space between us felt like something that had been measured and found wider than either of us had known. The ranch is mine, I said. Not unkindly, just as fact. It was your father's, and now it's mine, and I am not giving it up. Not to a development firm, not to investors in Dallas, and not to you. If you ever want to come back to Silver Creek the way you should have come back, to work it, to learn it, to love it the way it deserves to be loved, that's a different conversation, but that conversation can't happen today. I picked up my bag and walked to the door. Behind me, I heard Logan sit back down, and I heard the particular silence of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. I walked down the hallway of Walter's office building and out into the dry Oklahoma morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with my face turned toward the sky. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from the particular exhaustion of having held your ground for the first time against someone you love and found out that you could. I got in the truck and drove home. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are fictional. The drive home from Walter's office took 22 minutes. I know that because I counted. Not the miles. I've driven that road so many times I stopped seeing it years ago. But the minutes, because I needed something concrete to hold on to while my hands gripped the steering wheel and my mind kept replaying the look on Logan's face when Naomi Cross told him he didn't have a case. That expression. Raw and unguarded in a way I hadn't seen from him since he was maybe 14 years old and had broken something he couldn't fix and finally had to come tell me about it. I didn't let myself cry on the drive home. I'd made that decision somewhere around Walter's parking lot, and I held to it. Not because crying was wrong, but because I needed to get through the next few hours first. There would be time for the rest of it later, in the dark, in the room where I'd slept alone for 11 years and had gotten fairly practiced at falling apart quietly and putting myself back together before morning. When I pulled into the driveway at Silver Creek, Luke's truck was parked near the barn, and I could hear the sound of hammering from somewhere out past the west fence. Steady, rhythmic work, the sound of the ranch being maintained. I sat in my truck for a moment, just listening to it, and something in my chest that had been pulled tight since that morning in Walter's office slowly began to loosen. I changed out of my good clothes and went to find him. He was replacing posts along the west fence line, the section that had been listing badly since the previous winter when the ground shifted in a hard freeze. It was slow, physical work, pulling the old rotted posts, setting new ones, tamping the dirt back in tight around the base. Luke was working with the kind of focused quiet that meant he was thinking, and he didn't stop when he heard me coming, just glanced over once to confirm it was me and kept working. I picked up the spare tamping bar leaning against the fence line and started on the next post without being asked. We worked like that for a while without talking. That was one of the things I valued most about Luke Mercer. 14 years of working alongside someone teaches you that silence between people can mean 100 different things, and with Luke, it almost always meant comfort rather than distance. He wasn't ignoring me. He was giving me the thing I actually needed, which was physical work, and the company of someone who wasn't going to ask me to explain myself. After maybe 20 minutes, he said, without looking up from the post he was setting, "How'd it go?" Her attorney told him the case was weak, advised him against filing. Luke nodded once, still working. "So it's over." "The legal part?" "Yes." He straightened up and looked at me then. His face was weathered in the particular way of men who spend their lives outdoors. Deep lines around the eyes, skin the color of old saddle leather. And he had a way of looking at you directly that some people found uncomfortable. I had always found it steadying. "And the other part?" he asked. I drove the tamping bar down hard into the dirt around the post. "That's less clear." He didn't push. We went back to work. That evening I cooked a real dinner for the first time since Logan had arrived. Not out of celebration, but because I had been eating badly all week, grabbing whatever was fast and easy, and my body was complaining about it in the way bodies do when you've been running on anxiety and cold coffee for too many days straight. I made chicken and rice and a pot of pinto beans that had been soaking since morning, and I ate at the kitchen table alone with the radio on low. The architectural drawings were gone. I'd asked Luke to dispose of them the day after the revocation filing, and he had without comment, without ceremony. I hadn't watched him do it, but their absence from the corner of the table was something I noticed every time I sat down to eat, a negative space where someone else's plans for my life had briefly existed. I washed the dishes and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark. The west pasture was a flat shadow under a sky full of stars, which out here on the ranch, away from town lights, were extravagant and almost excessive in their brightness. Thomas had loved the night sky at Silver Creek. He used to drag a blanket out to the back field in summer and lie there for an hour just looking up, which drove me slightly crazy when there was still work to do, but which I would give a great deal to watch him do one more time. My phone showed no messages from Logan. I had not expected any, but there was still the small involuntary check, the habit of a mother looking for a sign from her child that apparently didn't turn off just because the child had tried to take your home. I set the phone face down on the counter and went to bed. The weeks that followed were not easy and they were not simple, and I want to be honest about that because it would be a lie to say I found some immediate peace and moved forward cleanly. That's not how it worked. Real life is messier than that, and I was messier than that. There were mornings when I woke up, and the first thing I felt before I was fully conscious was a grief so heavy it made getting out of bed feel like lifting something with no handles. Not grief for the ranch, so the ranch was still there, still mine. The cattle still needed feeding at the same and different hour they always needed feeding. It was grief for the shape of the future I had imagined and now had to unimagine. The version where Logan came home, where Silver Creek stayed in the family the way Thomas and I had always hoped. Where I grew old on this land surrounded by people who loved it the way I loved it. That future was gone. I had to build a different one, or learn to be at peace without one. And at 63 years old, that was harder work than any fence line. But I got up. Every morning. That much I could say for myself. But some. Luke noticed things without being asked to notice them, which was one of his better qualities and occasionally an annoying one. About 2 weeks after the meeting in Walter's office, he showed up one morning with his nephew, a broad-shouldered young man named Dale, who apparently had experience with cattle operations and was looking for work. Luke introduced him without fanfare, said Dale could help with the heavier lifting while the main herd needed moving to the north pasture for the season change, and looked at me with an expression that said he knew I'd been managing more than I should have been managing on my own. I hired Dale on a trial basis, mostly because my knee had been bad again, and the north pasture move genuinely needed more hands than just the two of us, and I was tired of pretending otherwise. Asking for help had never come easily to me. Thomas used to say I'd rather dislocate something than admit I couldn't reach it alone. He wasn't wrong. Having Dale around changed the rhythm of the work in ways both practical and unexpectedly good. He was quiet, competent, and had the particular gift of the very young of not carrying any of the weight of what had happened here. He didn't know the story. To him, Silver Creek was just a job, and watching someone move through this land without any of the grief or the history that I carried in every step I took across it was strangely a relief. It made the ranch feel less like a battlefield and more like itself. One afternoon in the third week, Luke and I were working the fence on the north side together while Dale moved the last of the cattle through the gate, and Luke said, out of nowhere, "You hear from him?" "No," I said. "You going to?" "Probably. Eventually. I don't know when." Luke pulled a staple from the fence post with the back of his hammer. "You doing okay with that?" I thought about it honestly, which I was trying to make a habit of. "Some days. Not every day." He nodded. "Fair enough." "I keep thinking I did something wrong," I said. "Somewhere. In how I raised him. In what I taught him to value." I hadn't said that out loud to anyone yet, and it felt strange leaving my mouth, like something that had been sitting in a closed room for weeks and was suddenly breathing open air. Luke was quiet for a moment. "You raised him the same way you do everything," he said, finally. "With everything you had. What he did with that is on him." "I know that's the right answer," I said. "Right answers are annoying that way," he said, and went back to the fence. I almost smiled. It was the first time in weeks that smiling had felt like something that could happen without forcing it. The East Fence project took the better part of a week and a half. It was the longest section that needed real work, not just tightening and restapling, but full post replacement in a dozen places, plus restringing wire where it had rusted through. Thomas had built the original East Fence the third year we owned the ranch, and even after all this time I could tell where his work was versus the repairs done over the years, because Thomas's posts were set deeper and the spacing was more even. He had done everything like it was going to outlast him, which most of it had. Working that fence brought up a lot of things I wasn't prepared for, not dramatically, not the kind of grief that drops you to your knees, but the quiet, persistent kind that sits next to you while you work and won't be hurried. I missed Thomas. I had missed him every day for 11 years, and I would probably miss him every day for whatever years I had left. And usually I had made my peace with that particular weight. But standing on the east fence line, replacing posts that his hands had set in the wake of what had happened with our son, the missing was sharper than usual, more specific. I found myself talking to him, which I did sometimes when I was alone on the land, not expecting an answer, just needing to say the words somewhere they could be heard by the air and the grass and the Oklahoma sky. "Logan tried to take the ranch," I said, driving a post. "I got it back. I think I handled it right. I'm not sure I handled the rest of it right. I'm not sure I know how." The wind moved through the grass on the other side of the fence, and the cattle in the north pasture made their low, indifferent sounds. "I'm still here," I said, "in case you were wondering." But the phone call came on a Tuesday evening in the 5th week, just after dark. I almost didn't answer. It was Logan's number, and I sat looking at it for 3 full rings, which is longer than it sounds, before I picked up. "Mom." His voice was careful. Not the businessman voice, not the controlled anger voice from that breakfast. Something more stripped down. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." "I almost didn't," I said, which seemed like the honest place to start. A pause. I wanted to. I've been trying to figure out what to say. I've been going back and forth on whether to call at all. What made you decide to? I don't know. It's been a bad few weeks. The investors pulled out. The partnership fell through. Another pause. I had to lay off 2 people who worked for me. I've never had to do that before. Fire people because a deal went south. I waited. I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty, he said, and his voice had enough self-awareness in it that I believed him. I know this is my fault. I know what I did. I wanted you to know that I understand it now, what it cost, not just me. What does that mean for you going forward? I asked. I don't know yet. I'm figuring it out. He exhaled. The thing I keep coming back to is that I had the ranch in front of me and I couldn't see it. I mean, I saw it as an asset, as an opportunity, as all these things it could be converted into. And I missed what it actually was. He stopped. What Dad built, what you've been keeping alive. I looked out the kitchen window into the dark where the ranch was, invisible but present, the way it always was. That's true, I said. I'm sorry for telling you to pack your things. His voice cracked slightly on the last 2 words, and he let it, which took something. I'm sorry for that specifically. You should never have had to hear that in your own home. From me. I held the phone and was quiet for a moment, and let myself feel the full complexity of what was happening, the anger that was still there, the love that was still there, the grief, the exhaustion, the stubborn hope that didn't fully die no matter how much sense dying would have made. I hear you, I said. Does that mean anything? Or is it just, are you saying you hear me? It means I hear you, Logan. It doesn't mean everything is fixed. Some things take longer than 5 weeks. I know. You're going to need to rebuild your business some other way, not with Silver Creek. I know that too. And if you ever want to come back here, not to develop it, not to leverage it, not to turn it into something else, but just to come home and learn what your father spent his life building, that door isn't locked. I paused. But I'm not holding it open indefinitely either. That's something I need you to understand. He was quiet for a long moment. Okay, he said finally. Yeah, okay. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular. The weather, a plumbing issue he was having in his Houston apartment, something almost painfully ordinary. And when we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The call hadn't fixed anything. I want to be clear about that. One phone call doesn't undo what was done, and it doesn't rebuild what was broken, and it doesn't give back the weeks I'd spent with my hands shaking and my sleep ruined and my heart doing the specific work of loving someone who had just tried to take everything from you. But it was something, a thread, thin and not entirely reliable the way threads are, but there. The following Saturday, I was out at the east pasture at first light, checking the new fence posts before the day got hot. Dale was coming in later to help with the south water trough that had been leaking at the base fitting, and Luke was due around noon with a load of hay from the feed store in town. The morning was clear and cool, the sky that pale particular blue of early autumn in Oklahoma, and the cattle were moving slowly in the near pasture, grazing in the unhurried way cattle have when nothing is troubling them. I walked the fence line with my coffee, checking each new post, and when I got to the corner where the east fence met the north, the corner closest to Thomas's elm, I stopped for a minute the way I sometimes did. The tree had gone fully gold. It happened fast in autumn, always faster than I expected, the leaves turning almost overnight from green to a yellow so bright it looked lit from inside. I stood there in the early quiet and thought about everything that had happened in the past 5 weeks, and about the version of Evelyn Hart who had sat in Walter's office 2 months ago and signed those papers believing she was doing the right thing, and about how much had broken since then and how much was still standing. The ranch was still standing. I was still standing. That was not nothing. In fact, standing there on that October morning with the dew still on the grass and the cattle moving slow and the old elm blazing gold against the blue sky, it felt like exactly enough. Not perfect, not healed, not finished, but enough to keep going. And sometimes that is the only victory that matters. Good. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are fictional. The winter that year came early and stayed long. By November, the ground had hardened, and the mornings were the kind of cold that got into your joints before you were fully awake. And I was out at 4:30 every day, the same as always, because the cattle didn't care about the temperature any more than they cared about what had happened with Logan, or the deed revocation, or the investors in Dallas, or any of the rest of it. Animals have a merciful indifference to human drama. I had always found that grounding, even on the mornings when I resented it. Luke had taken on more hours through the cold months without being asked, showing up earlier than necessary, and staying later than his pay required. He never mentioned it, and I never made a formal arrangement out of it. That was simply how things worked between us. 14 years of working alongside someone creates a kind of shorthand that doesn't need to be written down. Dale had moved on by December, picking up a longer-term position at a bigger operation 2 counties over, which I had expected and had no hard feelings about. He was young and needed more than a part-time situation could give him, and I told him so when he came to tell me he was leaving. The ranch was quieter with just Luke and me, but Quiet and Silver Creek had a long history together, and I had stopped being afraid of it. Logan called twice more before Christmas. The first call was brief, practical. He wanted to know if there was anything I needed for the property, which was his awkward way of trying to reopen a door without admitting he'd been the one to slam it. I told him the ranch was fine and asked about his work, and he said he'd taken a contract position with a smaller development firm, something steadier and less speculative than what he'd been doing before. He sounded tired in the way of someone who had been humbled by circumstances and was still deciding what to do with that. The second call was on Christmas Eve. He asked if he could come for a visit in the new year. Not to stay, just for a weekend. To see the place. I told him I'd think about it. I wasn't being cruel. I want to be clear about that. I had done a lot of thinking in the months since the meeting in Walter's office, and one of the things I had thought about most carefully was the difference between forgiveness and permission. A person can forgive something, can genuinely release the worst of the anger, can stop carrying the wound as an active injury, and still decide that certain doors need to stay closed. Those two things are not contradictions. They just feel like contradictions when you're standing inside the love that makes the closing so hard. I thought about Logan's visit for 2 weeks before I gave him an answer. He arrived on a Saturday in late January, pulling into the driveway in a different truck than the one he'd rented last time. An older model, more practical, without the gleam of performance signaling I'd noticed before. I was on the porch when he pulled up, coffee in hand, and I watched him get out and stand for a moment looking at the property before he looked at me. He looked different. I noticed it immediately. Not older exactly, though there was some of that. More like someone had taken the careful, managed surface he had arrived with last time, and it had been rubbed down to something raw and less polished underneath. He was wearing jeans and work boots instead of the pressed city clothes, and his hair needed cutting, and when he walked toward the porch, his hands were in his pockets in a way that made him look younger than his 41 years. "Mom," he said. "Logan." I stepped back and held the door. "Come inside. It's cold." He followed me into the kitchen and sat at the table while I poured him coffee, and we went through the small, careful motions of two people relearning how to be in a room together. He asked about the cattle, and I told him the winter losses had been minimal, just 2 calves, which was good for the season. He asked about Luke, and I said Luke was fine, same as always. He looked around the kitchen at the things that hadn't changed, my mother's quilt on the armchair visible through the doorway, the wooden side table Thomas had built, the photographs on the mantel, and something moved across his face that I chose not to try to name. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me, after the first cup of coffee. "About coming back to learn it, to actually learn the ranch the way Dad knew it." I set my cup down. "And?" "I think I want to try. Not right now. I've got commitments through the spring, but maybe after that. Come for longer stretches. Actually work it instead of just looking at what it's worth." He paused. "If that offer still stands." I looked at my son across the kitchen table and thought about all the things that had happened at this table in the past several months. The conversation about development plans, the revocation, the mornings I'd sat here alone trying to figure out how to feel about a person I couldn't stop loving, even when he was giving me every reason to. That offer still stands, I said carefully. But Logan, I need you to hear something first. He met my eyes and waited. If you come back here, you come back as someone who works this land, not someone who manages it from a distance or evaluates its potential or thinks about what it could be converted into. Silver Creek is a cattle ranch. It has been a cattle ranch for 3 generations, and as long as I'm alive, it will stay a cattle ranch. Those are not negotiable terms. They're just what this place is. I understand that, he said. I'm not sure you fully do yet, I said. And that's all right. It takes time to understand a place. Your father spent 20 years getting to really know this land. I'm not expecting you to arrive already knowing it, but I need you to come here willing to learn, not willing to manage. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment. I hear you. The other thing, I said, is that this is my home, mine. If you come here to work, you work for me, the same as Luke does. That's not punishment. That's just what's true. The ranch belongs to me, and when I'm gone, I'll decide what happens to it, on my own terms, in my own time. That decision won't be made under pressure or out of guilt, or because someone has investors waiting. Do you understand what I'm telling you? He flinched at that last part, but he didn't look away. Yes, he said. I understand. We sat with that for a moment, and the kitchen was quiet except for the wind pressing against the window and the low sound of the furnace running. Okay, I said. Then we'll see how the spring goes. What? He stayed for 2 days. The first day he mostly watched, followed Luke around without being asked, which told me something about how much he'd thought about what kind of arrival would go over better than his last one. Luke was cordial and measured in the way he was with anyone he hadn't yet decided about, answering questions directly without offering more than was asked for. I watched them from a distance and thought that this was probably the most useful thing Logan could do. Start from the beginning, without assumptions. On the second morning, Logan was up before me. I came downstairs at 4:30 to find him already in the kitchen with the coffee made, sitting at the table in the dark with his hands around his mug, looking out the window at the black nothing of early morning on the ranch. He startled slightly when I came in, then settled. Couldn't sleep? I asked. Woke up at 4, figured I'd be up. I poured myself coffee and sat across from him. Outside the window, nothing was visible yet, just the faint outline of the barn roof against a sky that was starting to think about lightning. It's different at this hour, he said. I didn't remember that. You grew up here. You've seen it plenty. I saw it as a kid. That's different. He turned the mug in his hands. I don't think I understood what you and Dad were actually doing out here. When I was young, I just thought it was, I don't know, the place we lived, the thing you did instead of having regular jobs. That's what children think, I said. They're not wrong exactly. It is the place you lived. But it was more than that. Yes, I said. It was more than that. He was quiet for a long moment. I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. All right, do you think I can do this? Actually do it. The physical work, the learning, the long-term commitment to a place that doesn't run on quarterly projections or investor meetings. He looked at me directly. Not just temporarily. Actually, do you think I have that in me? It was the most honest question he had asked me in years, maybe ever. I took my time answering because he deserved a real answer and not a reassuring one. I don't know, I said. I genuinely don't know. I think you have more of your father in you than you've been using. But Thomas didn't find this land until he was in his late 20s, and even then it took years before he stopped thinking about other things. The love for it doesn't come immediately. It builds. If you're willing to let it build, then maybe. I paused. But if you come here looking for a version of yourself you can feel good about, and you leave when it gets too hard or too slow or too unglamorous, then no. I don't think you can do it. He absorbed that without deflecting. That's a fair answer. It's an honest one. I stopped giving you the fair version a few months ago. Something passed between us at that. The acknowledgement of the whole history of the past year, compressed into a quiet moment over coffee at 4:30 in the morning, with the ranch still dark outside and the cattle beginning to stir somewhere beyond the window. I'll come back in April, he said, for 2 weeks, and I'll work. Actually, work. I'll hold a spot, I said. Chuck. He left after breakfast on the second day. I walked him to his truck, which was a thing we hadn't done together since he was a teenager leaving for college. Both of us finding things to say in the driveway to delay the actual goodbye. He hugged me before he got in, a real hug, arms actually around me, not the quick performative embrace of someone meeting a social obligation. I let myself lean into it for a moment. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly, into my hair, the way he used to as a boy. "For all of it." "I know," I said. And then he got in his truck and I watched him drive down the long driveway toward the county road. And I stood there until the truck disappeared past the tree line and the sound of the engine faded into the distance. And there was nothing left but the wind and the sound of Silver Creek running somewhere below the south pasture, which I could only hear on quiet mornings when the air was still enough. I stood there a little longer than I needed to. Not because I was sad, exactly, but because some moments deserve to be fully inhabited before you walk away from them. April came the way Oklahoma springs always do, fast and violent and beautiful. 1 week of cold and the next week 70 degrees and everything suddenly, urgently green. The cattle were restless the way they always were in spring, the calving season in full swing, and the pastures wet from 2 weeks of good rain, and Luke and I had our hands full every day from before dawn until the light quit. Logan arrived on a Thursday with a duffel bag and work boots that were clearly new, which I noticed and didn't comment on. I put him to work the next morning. Not gradually, not with an orientation period. I handed him a pair of gloves and told him what needed doing and let him figure out the rest alongside Luke, who was neither hard on him nor easy on him, but simply matter of fact, which was the best thing Luke could have offered. Logan struggled. I want to be honest about that because anything else would be dishonest about what it actually means to come back to something after a long absence and try to earn your place in it. He was soft in the way office work makes a person soft. His hands blistered by the second day. He moved too fast when he should have moved slow, and too slow when he should have moved fast. And there were moments when I watched him from across the field, making some mistake that any ranch-raised kid would have avoided. And I felt two things simultaneously. The impatience of a person watching work be done inefficiently, and a tenderness I hadn't expected. He didn't complain. That was what mattered. Whatever else Logan was, he wasn't a man who complained once he'd made a commitment. And through 10 days of fence work and feeding and calving assistance and the 1,000 unglamorous small tasks that make up the actual texture of this life, he showed up every morning before the sun, and he did the work. On the 8th day, we had a difficult calving, a heifer who'd gotten into trouble, first calf, the presentation all wrong. Luke and I had handled plenty of these over the years and knew what to do, but it was rough going and we needed the extra hands. Logan was there, doing exactly what he was told, calm in the way people sometimes find calm when a situation is serious enough to override their other concerns. The calf came through. The heifer came through. Logan stood in the barn afterward with blood on his arms up to the elbows and hay on his knees and the particular look of someone who has just done something real for the first time in a long time. That was... He stopped. I didn't know it was like that. Now you do, Luke said, perfectly neutral, walking past him with a bucket. Logan looked at me. I looked back at him. Go clean up, I said. Dinner's in an hour. He almost smiled. And then he did smile, which was the first real one I'd seen from him in longer than I wanted to count. He left after 2 weeks, as agreed. He came back in June for 10 days and in September for 3 weeks. Each time he arrived with boots that were less new, hands that were less soft, questions that were more specific and more useful. He and Luke reached a kind of understanding that wasn't warm exactly, but was respectful in the way that matters more than warmth between people who work together. I watched it happen gradually and didn't try to speed it along. He was not transformed. I need to say that plainly, because transformation is a word that gets thrown at stories like this one, as if it's something that happens cleanly and completely, like a switch that flips. Logan Hart did not become a different person. He was still ambitious and impatient and occasionally too confident in his own read of a situation. He still took phone calls I could tell were business-related and sometimes looked at the ranch with an expression I had to watch carefully to determine whether he was seeing what it was or what it could be made into. But he was trying, really trying, with the specific, ungainly effort of someone who is learning something they should have known earlier and is embarrassed about the gap. And trying, when it's genuine and sustained, is not nothing. It's actually something significant, even when it's imperfect. One Sunday evening in September, we were sitting on the back porch after supper, something we had fallen into on his longer visits, the way families fall into rhythms without planning them. And the sun was going down over the west fields in the way it did in September, all red and orange and extravagant, the sky at Silver Creek always putting on a show at the end of the day. Logan said, "Dad used to watch this every night." "When he could," I said. Sometimes the work didn't allow it, but when he could, yes. I remember now. He'd make us all come out, even when I was a teenager and thought it was boring. He shook his head. "I thought it was so boring." "You were 15, I said. "Everything is boring at 15. "I wish I'd paid more attention." He said it simply, without drama, looking out at the fields, not just to the sunset, to all of it, to what he was actually building out here. I looked at the side of my son's face in the fading light and thought about everything that had happened in the past year. The paper signed and revoked, the attorneys and the arguments and the sleepless nights, the phone calls and the visits and the slow, imperfect, non-linear work of rebuilding something that had been badly damaged. "You're paying attention now," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Is that enough?" I thought about Thomas, about the years it had taken him to really understand Silver Creek, about my own long history with this land, all the ways I had resented it and loved it and fought for it and been shaped by it in ways I was probably still discovering. "It's enough to start with," I said. Here is what I know now that I didn't know the morning I sat at Walter Pierce's desk and signed those papers. I know that love, real love, the kind built over decades and paid for in early mornings and physical work and small daily choices, cannot be transferred. You can transfer a deed. You can hand over a piece of paper that says a property belongs to someone else. But you cannot transfer 35 years of learning a land's moods, knowing which fence line floods first in heavy rain, which pasture runs short in a dry August, where the soil goes hard and where it stays soft. You cannot deed that over. It lives in the body of the person who earned it. I know that older people, like women especially, women who have spent their lives giving and accommodating and making themselves smaller so others could be bigger, are not obligated to keep giving until there is nothing left. There is no love in that. There is only depletion dressed up as sacrifice, and the people who benefit from it rarely understand what it cost until it stops. I know that a child can love a parent genuinely and still be capable of betrayal. Those things live together in a person. The love doesn't cancel the betrayal, and the betrayal doesn't cancel the love. And anyone who tells you family relationships are simpler than that has either been very fortunate or is not being honest with you. I know that protecting what you built is not selfishness. For a long time in my life, I would have called it selfishness, would have felt guilty for wanting to hold on to something, for saying no, for drawing a line and standing behind it. I have unlearned that guilt. It was never mine to carry. And I know that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet decision made at 8:52 in the morning to pick up the phone. Sometimes it is sitting in a lawyer's office with steady hands signing your life back to yourself. Sometimes it is standing in a driveway, watching your son drive away and not chasing after him, not calling him back, not softening the boundary because the love in you wants to, because you know in the deepest part of yourself that the boundary is the kindest thing you can give him. Silver Creek Ranch is still here. I am still here. The east fence holds. The cattle are fat going into winter this year, which is good news after the dry summer. The old elm at the edge of the east pasture has dropped its leaves for the season and stands bare and patient the way it always does, waiting for spring the way it has waited for every spring since Thomas planted it as a sapling the year we got married. Luke came by yesterday to check the water situation before the first hard freeze, and we had coffee on the back porch, even though it was cold enough that we could see our breath, because neither of us wanted to go inside yet. He asked about Logan, and I told him about the September visit, about the calving, about the Sunday evening on the porch. Luke listened and nodded and said, "He's getting there," in the tone of a man who has revised his opinion of someone carefully and is not going to overstate the revision. "Slowly," I said. "Slow's okay," Luke said. "Slow means it's real." I thought about that for a long time after he left. Slow means it's real. There is more truth in that sentence than in most things I've heard in the past year. So, if you are watching this story, if you have stayed with Evelyn Hart from that first morning when she sat in her chair by the window and made the phone call that changed everything, then I think you already know what I'm about to say because you have probably lived some version of it yourself. Someone asked too much of you. Someone you loved, someone you trusted, someone for whom you had already given more than was easy to give. They looked at everything you had built and they saw what they could take from it instead of what it was worth. And you had to decide what to do with that. Maybe you are still deciding. Maybe the papers haven't been signed yet, in whatever form your papers take. The conversation you need to have, the boundary you need to draw, the thing you have been about to do for months and keep finding reasons not to. Maybe you are sitting where I was sitting, by a window, watching someone walk across something that belongs to you with the walk of a person who has already decided it's theirs. I'm not going to tell you that it's easy. I'm going to tell you that it's possible. That you can love someone completely and still protect yourself from them. That the two things can exist in the same heart without one canceling the other out. That you're allowed to revoke the transfer. That you are allowed to stand in your own driveway and watch someone drive away and stay standing after the truck disappears. That is not the end of love. It is love refusing to destroy itself. Silver Creek is quiet tonight. The first freeze came through this afternoon, and the ground is hard, and the sky is clear and cold and full of stars. And I am sitting on the back porch with a blanket over my knees because the cold doesn't move me inside the way it used to, and the ranch is dark and still and completely, entirely mine. Thomas Hart built this land and I have kept it, and someday something will happen with it that I cannot predict from here. Because the future has never once cooperated with my plans for it, and I have stopped expecting it to. Logan may come back in the spring. He may not. The ranch may pass to him one day, or it may not. Life does not resolve in straight lines, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But tonight, on this porch, under this sky, on this land that I fought for and held and refused to surrender, I am at peace. Not the peace of everything being resolved, the peace of knowing what you stand on, the peace of a woman who knows the exact dimensions of what she has built and what she has protected and what she has survived, and has decided that is enough to rest in, at least for tonight. The stars over Silver Creek are something else. They always have been. Here is what I know now that I didn't know the morning I sat at Walter Pierce's desk and signed those papers. I know that love, real love, the kind built over decades and paid for in early mornings and physical work and small daily choices, cannot be transferred. You can transfer a deed. You can hand over a piece of paper that says a property belongs to someone else, but you cannot transfer 35 years of learning a land's moods, knowing which fence line floods first in heavy rain, which pasture runs short in a dry August, where the soil goes hard and where it stays soft. You cannot deed that over. It lives in the body of the person who earned it. I know that older people, women especially, women who have spent their lives giving and accommodating and making themselves smaller so others could be bigger, are not obligated to keep giving until there is nothing left. There is no love in that. There is only depletion dressed up as sacrifice, and the people who benefit from it rarely understand what it cost until it stops. I know that a child can love a parent genuinely and still be capable of betrayal. Those things live together in a person. The love doesn't cancel the betrayal, and the betrayal doesn't cancel the love. And anyone who tells you family relationships are simpler than that has either been very fortunate or is not being honest with you. I know that protecting what you built is not selfishness. For a long time in my life, I would have called it selfishness. Would have felt guilty for wanting to hold on to something, for saying no, for drawing a line and standing behind it. I have unlearned that guilt. It was never mine to carry. And I know that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet decision made at 8:52 in the morning to pick up the phone. Sometimes it is sitting in a lawyer's office with steady hands signing your life back to yourself. Sometimes it is standing in a driveway watching your son drive away and not chasing after him, not calling him back, not softening the boundary because the love in you wants to, because you know in the deepest part of yourself that the boundary is the kindest thing you can give him. Silver Creek Ranch is still here. I am still here. The east fence holds. The cattle are fat going into winter this year, which is good news after the dry summer. The old elm at the edge of the east pasture has dropped its leaves for the season and stands bare and patient the way it always does, waiting for spring the way it has waited for every spring since Thomas planted it as a sapling the year we got married. Luke came by yesterday to check the water situation before the first hard freeze. And we had coffee on the back porch, even though it was cold enough that we could see our breath, because neither of us wanted to go inside yet. He asked about Logan, and I told him about the September visit, about the calving, about the Sunday evening on the porch. Luke listened and nodded and said, "He's getting there," in the tone of a man who has revised his opinion of someone carefully and is not going to overstate the revision. "Slowly," I said. "Slow's okay," Luke said. Slow means it's real. I thought about that for a long time after he left. Slow means it's real. There is more truth in that sentence than in most things I've heard in the past year. If you are watching this story, if you have stayed with Evelyn Hart from that first morning when she sat in her chair by the window and made the phone call that changed everything, then I think you already know what I'm about to say because you have probably lived some version of it yourself. Someone asked too much of you. Someone you loved, someone you trusted, someone for whom you had already given more than was easy to give. They looked at everything you had built, and they saw what they could take from it instead of what it was worth. And you had to decide what to do with that. Maybe you are still deciding. Maybe the papers haven't been signed yet, in whatever form your papers take, the conversation you need to have, the boundary you need to draw, the thing you have been about to do for months, and keep finding reasons not to. Maybe you are sitting where I was sitting, by a window, watching someone walk across something that belongs to you with the walk of a person who has already decided it's theirs. I am not going to tell you that it's easy. I'm going to tell you that it's possible, that you can love someone completely and still protect yourself from them, that the two things can exist in the same heart without one canceling the other out, that you are allowed to revoke the transfer, that you are allowed to stand in your own driveway and watch someone drive away and stay standing after the truck disappears. That is not the end of love. It is love refusing to destroy itself. Silver Creek is quiet tonight. The first freeze came through this afternoon and the ground is hard and the sky is clear and cold and full of stars. And I am sitting on the back porch with a blanket over my knees because the cold doesn't move me inside the way it used to. And the ranch is dark and still and completely, entirely mine. Thomas Hart built this land and I have kept it. And someday something will happen with it that I cannot predict from here, because the future has never once cooperated with my plans for it, and I have stopped expecting it to. Logan may come back in the spring. He may not. The ranch may pass to him one day or it may not. Life does not resolve in straight lines, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But tonight, on this porch, under this sky, on this land that I fought for and held and refused to surrender, I am at peace. Not the peace of everything being resolved, the peace of knowing what you stand on, the peace of a woman who knows the exact dimensions of what she has built and what she has protected and what she has survived, and has decided that is enough to rest in, at least for tonight. The stars over Silver Creek are something else. They always have been.